Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're diving into a topic that might make you a little uneasy, maybe even send shivers down your spine. Martial law.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
You might think of it as something out of, I don't know, like a dystopian novel or something. But the truth is, it's a lot closer to home than you might think.
It really is.
And the source material we've got for this one, When Order Became Chaos, is it's packed with some seriously eye-opening insights. I mean, we're talking the history, the psychology, all the potential dangers of this whole idea of a last resort measure.
Right, because on the surface, martial law is often presented as this necessary evil.
Yeah.
Like it's the only way to restore order when everything's gone haywire.
Yeah.
But the deeper you dig, and this source really digs deep, you start to see a much darker pattern emerge, a really disturbing one, actually.
Yeah, and it comes out swinging, this source, right from the first page. It basically argues that throughout history, martial law has been used more often to control people than to protect them.
Exactly. And one of the biggest reasons for that is, well, it's the very nature of emergency powers.
Right.
They're intentionally broad, they're vague. It's like giving someone a blank check, but with the power of the military behind it, you know?
Okay, so let's break this down a little. I mean, for people who are maybe hearing about this for the first time, what is martial law, really? It's not like one day the army just shows up and takes over, right?
Well, not exactly. I mean, technically speaking, it is the military taking control over civilian stuff, but there's usually some kind of crisis, a trigger.
Okay.
You know, it could be a natural disaster, an insurrection, maybe even a pandemic. The idea is things are so bad, we got to suspend the normal rules, give the military authority to get things back on track.
So it's like hitting the giant reset button.
Kind of, yeah. But here's the thing. Every country's got its own laws about how all that works.
So in some places, it might be crystal clear when and how martial law kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
But in others, it's kind of open to interpretation, huh?
Exactly. And that's where things can get really dangerous. Because that lack of clarity, well, it creates this gap that those in power can exploit, you know? They can kind of twist things to fit their agenda.
So it's not just about the military stepping in. It's about who's calling the shots, what their real motives are.
Right. And that's why it's so important to understand the psychology of power. You give someone absolute authority, no oversight, no accountability.
Right.
It's going to change them.
Yeah. It's like that famous Lord Acton quote, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
It's textbook, really.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our source walks us through some truly striking examples from ancient Rome all the way to today.
Yeah, like Julius Caesar. Didn't he basically use his position as, dictator?
Mm-hmm.
To basically grab power and dismantle the whole Roman Republic?
He did. I mean, he initially came to power legitimately, but then he used this state of emergency to justify extending his rule.
Indefinitely.
And history tells us that did not end well for him. Or for the Roman Republic, for that matter. And this seems to be a pattern throughout history, right? The source talks about medieval kings using martial law to squash, like, even the tiniest rebellions.
Unfortunately, yeah. It's a recurring theme. You see, those in power, they sense even the slightest threat to their authority, and boom, martial law. And it wasn't always about full-blown uprisings. Sometimes it was just about silencing anyone who dared to question them, you know?
So even way back then, it was about controlling the narrative, making sure everyone stayed in line.
Absolutely. And if you fast forward to more recent times, well, the same pattern plays out in even more chilling ways.
Yeah, the source talks about Napoleon and Hitler both using these emergency powers, these states of siege and decrees and all that, basically paving the way for authoritarian rule, right?
Right. And those are just two examples. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, we've seen so many leaders using crises to justify martial law, and the consequences, they're often disastrous.
Okay, so we've established that martial law has this long, complicated history, and that it's often been used to suppress dissent, consolidate power, rather than actually protect people. But what about today? Is this just a relic of the past? Are we still seeing these kinds of abuses in the 21st century?
Sadly, the answer is a resounding yes. And the source highlights some examples that are, they're really disturbing. Take Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines back in 1972.
Right.
He declared martial law, claiming it was necessary to combat a communist insurgency, restore order, all that. But in reality, he was using it to extend his own rule, silence his critics, basically turn the country into his own personal dictatorship.
And didn't something similar happen in Myanmar just a few years ago?
Yes. In 2021, the military staged a coup, imposed martial law. They claimed the recent elections were fraudulent. led to massive protests, of course. And how did the military respond? Brutal force.
Wow.
They arrested activists, shut down media outlets, even used live ammunition against peaceful demonstrators. It was a brutal crackdown.
So even in the 21st century, the playbook for abusing martial law, it hasn't really changed much.
Sadly, no. And what's even more concerning is that with the rise of social media, with misinformation spreading like wildfire,
Right.
it's become easier than ever for leaders to manipulate public perception, to create these conditions where people are actually clamoring for martial law, thinking it's the only solution.
It's like they're weaponizing fear to get what they want.
Exactly. And that's why now more than ever, we have to be so critical of the information we're consuming and aware of our own biases, our own fears. They can be exploited.
It really can. So we've talked about the history, the psychology, some very disturbing modern-day examples. But I'm curious, what does the source say about why martial law so often backfires? I mean, you think having the military step in would automatically bring stability, right?
You would, but it seems like more often than not, it just creates more chaos and more violence.
Exactly. So what's the disconnect there?
That's a fantastic question. And the source tackles it head on. You see, there are a lot of factors at play here, but one of the most significant is the nature of power itself.
Right.
You concentrate that much authority in the hands of a few, no checks and balances, no accountability. It's a breeding ground for corruption and abuse.
Yeah, like we said, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
It does, and we see this over and over throughout history. Caesar, Henry VIII, Marcos. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Leaders get unchecked power, they get intoxicated by it, their judgment gets clouded, they start believing their own propaganda,
Right.
and they become totally isolated from the people they're supposed to be serving.
And then there's the whole element of fear and panic, right? The source argues that throughout history, rulers have used fear to justify their control. I mean, when people are scared, they're more likely to accept drastic measures, even if it means giving up their freedom.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
Because fear is a powerful motivator.
Yeah.
It can make people act irrationally, make them willing to surrender their rights in exchange for the promise of security. We give up a little freedom now for safety later.
Right. So it's not just about individual bad actors then. It's about the system itself, how fear can be used to manipulate and control entire populations.
It is, and that's why it's so important for all of us to be aware of these dynamics, to understand how they play out in the real world, and to be wary of any attempts to use fear as a justification for taking away our freedoms. Because once those freedoms are gone, it can be incredibly difficult to get them back.
That is a sobering thought. But the source doesn't just dwell on the negatives here, right? It also looks at some of the more unexpected, maybe even surprising facts about martial law, its history, how it's been applied.
Oh, absolutely. There are some real jaw-droppers in there.
Okay, I've got to hear this. What are some of the most interesting things you found? Like, what were some of those, what moments that made you stop and think?
Well, one that comes to mind is the story of the 1971 crisis in Pakistan.
Okay, Pakistan. Tell me more.
So Pakistan declares martial law, right? Trying to suppress these regional protests, maintain control. But instead of calming things down, it triggers a full-blown war.
Wow. So the exact opposite of what they were going for.
A colossal backfire resulted in the Bangladesh Liberation War, a conflict marked by just horrific atrocities, and ultimately the creation of a whole new nation, Bangladesh.
It's wild. It's a stark example of how martial law, meant to preserve order, can actually lead to chaos and even, well, the breakup of a nation.
It really is. It's tragic, but it's a powerful illustration of the unintended consequences that can happen when you try to control people through force and suppression.
For sure. Okay, so we've got ancient Rome, we've got medieval Europe, 20th century Pakistan. Any other of those, what moments that really stood out to you?
Well, the source also dives into the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989.
Right.
The Chinese government declared martial law to crush those pro-democracy protests, and it led to the deaths of, well, hundreds, if not thousands of students. It was a horrific event.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking. And a stark reminder of what martial law can look like when it's used to silence dissent.
Exactly. These events show that often martial law doesn't resolve crises. It just buries them under a mountain of bloodshed.
So far, every example we've looked at paints a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, does the source offer any examples of martial law being used effectively, without descending into tyranny or violence?
That's a great question. And it's one that the source addresses directly. Because while it's clear that martial law has a long and frankly troubling history of abuse,
Right.
There are a few instances where it has been used for, well, for legitimate purposes and with positive outcomes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Sure. The source points out that right after a natural disaster, for example, martial law can be helpful. Coordinating relief efforts, maintaining order, keeping people safe.
Okay.
In those situations, the military's logistics, their discipline, that can be crucial for getting aid to those who need it most, and for preventing chaos and violence.
So in very specific short-term scenarios, martial law can actually be a force for good.
It can, but it's a very delicate balance. The source stresses that the longer martial law stays in place, the greater the risk of abuse, the more likely it is to have negative consequences.
So it's like any tool, really. It could be used for good or for evil, depending on who's holding it and what their goal is.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to know the historical precedents, to understand the potential pitfalls, to be really wary of any attempts to normalize martial law, to make it seem like it should be in place longer than it needs to be.
It makes sense. So it sounds like even in the rare cases where martial law might be justified, it's crucial to have some really strong safeguards in place to make sure it doesn't get out of control.
Absolutely. Things like crystal clear legal frameworks, robust oversight, and of course a free and independent press, those are all essential.
For sure. Well, this has been a thought-provoking conversation, to say the least. We've gone from ancient Rome all the way to modern-day Myanmar. And it seems like one thing's clear. Martial law is often presented as a solution, but it can actually be a very dangerous and slippery slope.
It can. It's a topic that deserves a lot more attention, especially in today's world.
I agree. And I think the source does a really good job of raising some important questions. Questions about the balance between security and freedom, about the role that we as citizens need to play in protecting our democracies.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for everyone to reflect on those questions, to think about how they apply to their own lives and the societies they live in. Because the reality is that martial law isn't just some historical phenomenon. It's a potential threat that exists in every country, no matter its political system and no matter its level of development.
That's a great point. And it brings us to that crucial question that the source asks. If your government declared martial law tomorrow, would you be prepared?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But it's one we all need to grapple with. Because understanding history, recognizing the warning signs, being prepared to defend our freedoms.
Right.
That's the best way to prevent those freedoms from being taken away in the first place.
Well said. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Well, we've only just scratched the surface.
Exactly. So stay with us as we continue our deep dive into the world of martial law. We'll be exploring some even more surprising and unsettling examples from the source. And we'll be discussing what you as an individual can actually do to protect yourself and your freedoms in what feels like an increasingly uncertain world.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Before we jump into some of the crazier examples from the source, let's circle back to this idea that martial law often makes things worse, not better.
Yeah.
You'd think bringing in the military would automatically stabilize things, right? I mean, that's the whole point.
It seems logical. But when order becomes chaos, the source we're looking at here, it suggests that's rarely the case. And I'm really fascinated by that disconnect. Like, what's going on in someone's head when they're suddenly given that level of power? What does it do to them?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Think about it this way. When you give someone absolute authority, no checks and balances, no one to tell them no, their sense of reality can get really warped.
Right.
They're surrounded by yes men, shielded from any criticism, and after a while, they start to believe their own hype.
So they basically create this bubble where the rules no longer apply, and they actually believe they're doing the right thing, even when it's clearly harmful.
Exactly. It's not always about being evil or malicious, at least not at the start. It's about how power fundamentally changes your worldview.
Yeah.
Any opposition starts to look like a threat. Any criticism feels like treason. Anyone who dares to question their authority, well, they're attacking the very foundation of society.
And that's a slippery slope, man. Once you start down that path, it's almost impossible to turn back.
It really is. And the source drives this point home with some chilling historical parallels. Remember Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines?
Yeah.
He used martial law to amass a fortune, silence anyone who opposed him, and basically rule as a dictator for years.
Right.
It wasn't about saving the country. It was about power, pure and simple.
And then there's Tiananmen Square, just a brutal example of a government driven by paranoia and a need for absolute control. using force to crush any dissent.
Absolutely. They framed any opposition as a threat to their authority and justified their actions in the name of stability, even though it resulted in, well, in a massacre.
Yeah. And these aren't just isolated incidents. It's a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it?
Oh.
Leaders convincing themselves that they're the only ones who can save the day, leading to the very chaos they claim to be preventing.
It is. It's a reminder that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, especially when you add unchecked power into the mix.
That's for sure. What strikes me is how martial law strips away any sense of nuance, of complexity. It becomes this black and white world, us versus them, good versus evil.
Yeah, it's like all rational thought goes out the window.
Exactly. Suddenly, disagreeing is treason, any protest is a threat to national security, and criticizing the government. Forget about it. That's sabotage.
It is, and that's the real danger. The source argues that this kind of thinking, this oversimplification, fueled by a fear and a thirst for absolute control, well, it's led to some of the darkest moments in human history.
And it's not just ancient history, right? We've already touched on some modern examples, but the source goes even deeper, pointing to some jaw-dropping instances where martial law was used to justify some truly horrific acts.
Absolutely. We're talking massacres, torture, people just disappearing, real-life consequences for real people.
Right.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some theoretical concept we're discussing. Martial law has a very real and often very brutal impact on people's lives, on entire societies.
And it's not limited to dictatorships or authoritarian regimes either. Even in democracies, the idea of using martial law as a quick fix, a way to bypass all those messy democratic processes can be really tempting.
It can, and that's why it's so important for citizens to understand the dangers, to know what's happened in the past, and to be willing to speak out against any attempts to chip away at those fundamental rights, because once they're gone,
Right.
they can be incredibly hard to get back.
Okay, so what does it actually look like to be prepared for the possibility of martial law? It feels like such a big, overwhelming question, especially given the scale of what we're talking about.
It is. It's daunting, but not impossible. I think the first step is education. Understanding the history, the patterns, the warning signs, we need to know how martial law has been used and abused in the past.
Right, so we can spot happening again, even if it looks a little different this time.
Exactly. And we can't just passively absorb this information, right? We need to talk about it with our friends and families, challenge each other's assumptions, think critically about what we're hearing and reading.
Exactly, because complacency is the enemy here. We need to be vigilant, informed, and willing to stand up for our rights, both individually and as a community. And the source makes a strong case for the power of collective action, It's about recognizing that our freedoms are intertwined. What affects one of us affects all of us.
Yeah, a threat to one is a threat to all.
Exactly. And that action can take many forms. It can be as simple as staying informed, having those difficult conversations, or supporting organizations that are fighting to protect civil liberties. Or it can be more active, like participating in protests, contacting your elected officials, challenging unjust laws.
Okay, so we're not just talking about stocking up on supplies and building a bunker in the backyard.
No. Although being prepared for emergencies is never a bad idea.
Yeah.
But the best defense against martial law is a strong, informed citizenry that understands its rights and is willing to defend those rights. So in a way, the best preparation is making martial law unnecessary in the first place.
Exactly. By strengthening our institutions, holding our leaders accountable, and creating a culture of respect for human rights.
It's interesting. As we're talking about all this, I keep coming back to that hypothetical scenario the source presented. What if martial law became permanent? How would that actually change our day-to-day lives?
It is a chilling thought experiment. It makes you confront what's at stake, because permanent martial law would completely change our society.
Yeah. Trading a world with rules, even flawed ones, for a world where the rules are made up as we go along by whoever happens to be in charge.
Exactly. Imagine no freedom of speech, no right to assemble, no due process, a world where you could be arrested or just disappear without any legal recourse, where the government controls all information and any dissent is met with swift and brutal force.
It sounds straight out of a dystopian novel, honestly.
It does, and that's why it's so important to be proactive. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to be informed and engaged if we want to protect those freedoms and prevent that kind of future from becoming reality.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of complacency. But what about the flip side? What about overreacting? I mean, we don't want to become so paranoid that we see threats everywhere.
That's a valid point. We need to strike a balance, being aware of the potential threats, but also keeping things in perspective. It's about being informed without becoming alarmist, about being prepared without letting fear take over.
So how do we walk that line? How do we stay informed and vigilant without letting fear run our lives?
It starts with being really careful about the information we consume. Don't just believe everything you read or hear, right? Be critical. Ask questions. Look for different perspectives.
So don't just retreat into our echo chambers, surrounding ourselves with people who already agree with us.
Exactly, because that's how misinformation spreads, and that's how fear can be used to manipulate us.
So be critical, be informed, and be willing to have open conversations with people, even if they have different views than we do.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of individual action. Even small acts of resistance can make a difference. Speaking out against injustice, supporting organizations that protect human rights, even just talking to your friends and family about these issues.
Yeah.
Every little bit helps.
It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting our freedoms, that we're not powerless in the face of these threats.
We're not. And that's something the source really hammers home. It's not about giving in to fear or despair. It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge, connecting with each other, and taking action to protect the values we hold dear.
Okay, so we've explored the history, the psychology of power, the very real dangers of martial law. But there's another layer to this story, right? The source refers to some unexpected and sometimes downright absurd moments in history. We touched on Tiananmen Square, but what about some of these other fun facts and WTF takeaways you mentioned earlier?
Right. I saved some of the good stuff for you. Because honestly, amidst all the seriousness, there are these moments where you just have to shake your head and laugh in disbelief.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of these WTF moments?
Well, one that jumped out at me was about Hurricane Katrina in the U.S. Remember that?
Yeah.
Well, martial law was declared after the storm, soldiers deployed to restore order, but things went very, very wrong.
Wait, in the U.S., I remember Katrina, the devastation, but I don't recall anything about martial law.
It wasn't widely reported, but it happened. And it really highlights how, even in a country like the U.S., with a long history of civil liberties, things can go south under martial law.
So what happened? How did it go wrong?
Well, soldiers operating under incredibly stressful, chaotic conditions, right?
Yeah.
And they ended up firing on civilians based on, well, basically rumors of looting.
Well,
And many of those people they targeted, they were just trying to survive. They weren't criminals. It was a tragic example of how unchecked authority mixed with fear and bad information can lead to truly awful consequences.
it really makes you think, doesn't it? Even in a democracy, the line between order and chaos can be incredibly thin. And when you suspend the rule of law, even for what seem like good reasons, well, the potential for abuse is always there.
It is. And it's not just about bad apples, individual soldiers making bad decisions. It's about the systems we have in place, the checks and balances, and how vigilant we are as a society in making sure power isn't abused.
Okay, so we've got Hurricane Katrina. What else is in this bag of fun facts?
Well, the source points out this fascinating, if somewhat disturbing, connection between martial law and massacres throughout history.
Whoa, okay. Give me some examples.
Think about Bloody Sunday in Russia, 1905. Tsarist troops fired on peaceful protesters, killing hundreds. Or the Kent State shootings in the U.S. in 1970, where National Guard soldiers opened fire on unarmed student demonstrators, killing 4 and wounding 9.
Wow. So it's not just about the potential for those in power to abuse martial law, but also about the inherent dangers of using soldiers who are trained for combat to control civilians.
You got it. And the source points out that these aren't isolated incidents. Throughout history, there's this disturbingly consistent pattern of violence against civilians whenever martial law is declared and the military steps in to maintain order.
Makes you wonder if there's ever a situation where declaring martial law doesn't carry a huge risk of violence and human rights violations.
It's a tough question, and it's one that every society has to grapple with, weighing the potential benefits against the very real risks.
Right, because the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, or so they say.
They do. Okay, so we've got Hurricane Katrina, Bloody Sunday, Kent State. Any other examples that really stand out?
Well, this one might surprise you. It happened just last year in 2022. The president of Peru tried to dissolve Congress and impose martial law, saying it was necessary to combat corruption. Wait, Peru? I hadn't heard about that. What happened?
His attempt to seize power totally backfired. He was removed from office and is now facing some serious charges.
Wow, so this isn't just something that happens in history books or in far-off countries. It can happen anywhere, anytime.
Exactly. And it shows that even in the 21st century, the temptation to use martial law as a shortcut to power is very real. It's a reminder that this isn't just history. It's a threat that democracies all over the world are facing.
It's a good reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted.
We can't. We need to know the warning signs, understand how things can go wrong, and be ready to speak out against any attempts to take away our rights. As the source says, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
Okay, so we've talked about the psychology of power, the history of martial law, some pretty disturbing real-world examples. But before we move on, I want to go back to a question the source asks. If your government declared martial law tomorrow, would you be prepared? What does that even look like?
It's the question we should all be asking ourselves. And while there's no easy answer, there are definitely some things we can do to be ready, both mentally and practically.
All right, let's talk about that. What are some concrete steps people can take?
Well, step one is mental preparation. It's about accepting that things could change drastically overnight.
Okay, so acknowledging that life as we know it could be disrupted and being ready to adapt.
Right. And it's also about making a plan. What if you suddenly lost access to electricity, water, or communication? Where would you go? Who would you contact?
So it's like preparing for a natural disaster, but on a societal level.
In a way, yes. But it's also about preparing for a potential loss of freedoms. What if you could no longer speak your mind, gather with others, or access information freely?
Whoa. Okay, so it's not just about physical safety. It's about protecting our rights, our ability to think and act freely.
It is, and that's where community comes in. The source really emphasizes the importance of strong social networks, connecting with like-minded people, building support systems. Because when things get tough,
Right.
we need each other.
It's about knowing we're stronger together.
Exactly. And it's about being prepared to resist, not just physically, but intellectually and emotionally. It's about holding on to our values, our principles, our belief in a better future, even when things seem bleak.
So it's about having a plan, but it's also about having hope.
It is, and that's a powerful thing to carry with us as we navigate these uncertain times.
I like that. A reminder that even though the threat is real, we are not powerless. We can choose how we respond, how we prepare, and how we resist.
We can, and that power lies in knowledge, in community, and in believing that things can get better.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot today. The history of martial law, the psychology of power, chilling real-world examples, practical tips for preparing. What are your final thoughts on this topic?
I think the key takeaway is vigilance. Martial law isn't just some historical curiosity or something you see in movies. It's a real threat, and it's a threat everywhere. But it's not inevitable. We can push back, we can defend our freedoms, and we can create a world where martial law is a thing of the past.
I agree. And I'll have one more thought for our listeners. We've focused on the dangers of martial law, but the opposite isn't just the absence of military rule. It's a society where human rights are respected, where the rule of law is paramount, where everyone has a voice. That's the world we should be striving for, not just as a defense against tyranny, but as a better way to live.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's a world we're fighting for.
All right, deep divers, that's our look at martial law. It's a complex and, honestly, a pretty disturbing topic, but one we need to understand if we want to protect ourselves, protect our communities, and build a better future. Thanks for joining us. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something else that will make you think. Welcome back to Deep Dive. We've spent this episode, well, exploring some pretty dark territory, haven't we? I mean, martial law, it's not exactly a light topic.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt. But as our source, when order becomes chaos, points out, understanding this whole concept, it's essential if we care about freedom and democracy.
Exactly. And it's really hit home for me that martial law isn't just some theoretical idea. It's got real-world consequences, and often they're brutal and they last a long time.
That's right. And one thing the source really drives home is that the damage of martial law goes beyond what happens while it's in effect.
Right.
It can erode trust. It can make authoritarian tactics seem normal, even create a climate of fear that can last for generations.
Yeah, it's like a scar on the soul of a society. A constant reminder of a time when the rules didn't matter and those in power could do whatever they wanted. So I guess the question is, what can we actually do about it? Other than, feeling helpless and overwhelmed.
Well, that's where things get interesting. The source doesn't just leave us feeling hopeless. It actually offers some advice, some practical steps we can take to push back against these forces and protect ourselves.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does it suggest?
Education is a big one. But not just boring history lectures. It's about understanding the patterns, the warning signs, the ways that those in power have always used fear and chaos to get what they want.
So it's about recognizing the playbook, even if the players are different each time.
Exactly. It's about being able to spot those subtle changes, those little erosions of our norms, the slow creep of losing our freedoms. Because martial law, it rarely happens overnight. It's a gradual process.
It's terrifying, really. So education is key.
Mm-hmm.
But what else? Is it just about being informed?
That's a great start, but we've got to do more than just read about it. The source makes a big deal about collective action, joining forces with others who share our values, building networks, communities of resistance, that kind of thing.
So it's about realizing that we're stronger together than we are on our own. That even small acts of defiance, when enough people do them, can have a real impact.
Exactly. It could be going to town hall meetings, writing to our elected officials, supporting groups fighting for our rights, even just talking about these issues with our friends and family. It all matters.
So it's not about hunkering down and hoping for the best then. It's about being proactive, raising awareness, making it clear that we won't stand by and watch our freedoms disappear.
Right. And the source is full of incredible stories of how everyday people have stood up to authoritarianism throughout history.
So education, community action. Any other strategies for pushing back against martial law?
Legal preparedness is a big one. It's about understanding how the law works around martial law, what our rights are, and being prepared to challenge any abuses of power.
So knowing the law, but also being ready to use it.
Right, because a lot of times those in power will try to justify what they're doing by saying it's legal. But if you look closely, a lot of it's unconstitutional or violates international human rights.
It's about doing our research, knowing what our rights are, and being prepared to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly, and it's about documentation. If you see abuses happening, write it down, take pictures, record videos, and share it with people you trust.
So if you see something, say something.
Exactly, because in the age of information, documentation is power. It's how we hold those in power accountable.
Okay, so we've got education, community action, legal preparedness, anything else we can do.
Building resilience is key too, both individually and as a community.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
Well, for individuals, it means taking care of ourselves, our physical and mental health, learning practical skills that could be useful in a crisis, and building strong relationships.
So things like knowing basic first aid, gardening, even fixing things around the house.
Exactly. If martial law happens, we may not be able to depend on the government for those things.
Makes sense. What about resilience at a community level?
It's about strengthening local networks, supporting local businesses, building systems where we help each other out. We can't rely on the government or big institutions to take care of us. We need to be able to take care of ourselves and each other.
So it's about decentralization, being more self-sufficient, fostering that spirit of community, right?
Exactly. Because when things go wrong, it's often our communities that step up first and provide the most support.
This is great information. But I wonder if the source addresses, the ethical side of resisting martial law. If the government says they're acting in our best interests, is it ever okay to defy their orders?
That's a huge question, and one that's been debated for centuries. It really comes down to each person's conscience and weighing the potential risks and benefits.
So no easy answer.
No. But the source does offer some guidance. It says we should always try to resist nonviolently, to be strategic, thoughtful, and avoid unnecessary danger. And it encourages us to build broad movements, lots of people working together to put pressure on those in power.
So choosing our battles carefully and understanding that sometimes the best way to resist is to simply refuse to cooperate.
Exactly. And recognizing that this fight for freedom, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It takes patience, persistence, and knowing that there will be setbacks along the way.
Well, this has been an incredible look at martial law. We've gone from the history to the psychology, from real-world examples to practical tips for preparing and resisting. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is, don't be complacent. The threat of martial law is real. It's everywhere. But it doesn't have to happen. We have the power to resist, to protect our freedoms, and to build a better world. But it starts with awareness, education, and taking action.
Well said. And I want to add one final thought for our listeners. We've talked a lot about the dangers of martial law, but the opposite isn't just the absence of the military. It's a society where human rights are respected, the rule of law matters, and citizens have a voice. That's the world we should be fighting for, not just as a defense against tyranny, but as a vision for a better future.
I couldn't agree more. That's a future worth fighting for.
All right, deep divers, that's our deep dive into martial law. It's been intense, for sure, but these are things we need to understand if we want to protect our freedoms and build a better future. Thanks for joining us. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into something that'll make you think.